the man searching for his lost leg. It's been a while since all this started, but I still can't shake the feeling that something's not right in this town. I moved here last fall for a job transfer. They called it a promotion, but it felt more like being exiled to the middle of nowhere. The town itself is small, the kind of place you'd miss if you blinked while driving through. It's nestled in a valley, surrounded by dense forests that seem to press in on all sides. The buildings are old, most of them dating back to when the railroad was the lifeblood of the community. Now, the tracks are rusted and overgrown, a reminder of better days long past. At first, everything seemed normal. Well, as normal as it can be when you're the new guy in a small town where everyone knows everyone else. People were polite enough, but there was always this undercurrent of something. Like they were all in on a secret that I wasn't privy to. I tried to settle into a routine. Wake up, go to work at the factory on the edge of town, come home, repeat. But as the days grew shorter and the nights longer, I started noticing things. Little things at first, easy to dismiss. Like how people would suddenly stop talking when I entered the local diner. Or the way some of the older folks would give me these long, searching looks, as if they were trying to decide something about me. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that it was just the stress of the move and the new job getting to me. But then the dreams started. It was always the same dream. I'd find myself standing on an old railway platform. The air would be thick with fog, and I could hear the distant sound of a train whistle. And there, at the edge of the platform, would be a figure. Always with its back to me, always slightly out of focus. But the one thing I could see clearly was that where its right leg should be, there was just empty space. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. But as the days passed, the dream started to feel more real. Sometimes, I'd swear I could still hear that whistle echoing in my ears even after I was awake. I tried to shake it off. Told myself it was just my imagination running wild in this quiet town. But then came the night that changed everything. It was a Friday, and I'd stayed late at work to finish up some reports. By the time I left, the sun had long since set, and a thick fog had rolled in from the surrounding hills. The streetlights cast eerie, diffused glows in the mist, barely illuminating the sidewalk. I was about halfway home when I heard it. A sound that made me stop dead in my tracks. It was a sort of dragging, scraping noise, like something heavy being pulled across the pavement. And it was coming from behind me. I turned around slowly, my heart in my throat. At first, I couldn't see anything through the fog. But then, as if the mist itself was parting, a figure emerged. It was a man. Or at least, it had been a man once. His skin was pale, almost translucent in the weak light. His clothes were old-fashioned, like something from a black and white photograph. But what made my blood run cold was his right leg. Or rather, the lack of it. Where his right leg should have been, there was nothing. Not a stump, not a prosthetic. Just absence. And yet, somehow, he was moving towards me, dragging himself forward with a horrible, uneven gait. I wanted to run. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn and flee. But I was frozen in place, unable to move, unable even to blink. As the figure drew closer, I could see its face more clearly. Its eyes were sunken, filled with an indescribable sorrow. And then, to my horror, it spoke. "My leg, where is my leg?" The voice was barely more than a whisper, but in the silence of the foggy night, it seemed to echo all around me. I opened my mouth to respond, but no sound came out. The figure reached out towards me with a pale, trembling hand. "Please, help me find my leg." Just then, a car turned the corner, its headlights cutting through the fog. I blinked, momentarily blinded, and when I looked back, the figure was gone. The only evidence that it had ever been there was a lingering chill in the air and the echo of those haunting words in my mind. I ran home, not stopping until I was safely inside with the door locked behind me. I spent the rest of the night huddled on my couch, every creak of the old house making me jump. When morning came, I tried to convince myself it had all been a hallucination. Stress, lack of sleep, and overactive imagination, surely there had to be a rational explanation. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. The next few days were a blur. I went through the motions at work, but my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't stop thinking about the figure, about its missing leg, about the desperation in its voice. I started paying more attention to the town, to the people around me. I noticed how the older residents would avoid talking about the town's history. How some people would take the long way around rather than walk past the old railway station. But I didn't dare ask anyone about what I'd seen. Something told me that would be a bad idea. Instead, I found myself lying awake at night, straining to hear any unusual sounds, half expecting, and half dreading, to see that figure again. It was about a week after my encounter when I overheard a conversation at the diner. Two old-timers were talking in low voices, unaware that I could hear them from my booth. "It's happening again," one of them said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just like back then." "Hush," the other replied, glancing around nervously. "You know we're not supposed to talk about that. But people are seeing things, hearing things. We can't just ignore it. We can, and we will. You know what happened to those who didn't keep quiet last time." Before I could hear more, the waitress came to refill my coffee, and the old men fell silent. But their words stuck with me. What had happened back then? What were people seeing and hearing? And what had happened to those who didn't keep quiet? I wanted to dig deeper, to uncover the truth behind this strange town and its one-legged apparition. But every time I thought about asking questions or doing research, a chill would run down my spine. It was as if something was warning me to leave well enough alone. But even as I tried to ignore it, to go about my daily life, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I'd catch a glimpse of something. A shadow where there shouldn't be one. A figure at the edge of the woods. And always, that sense of absence, of something missing. The dreams continued, becoming more vivid with each passing night. Sometimes now, I'd hear the figure calling out to me, begging for help, asking me to find its leg. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the phantom pain of a limb I'd never lost aching in the darkness. I know how this all sounds. If someone had told me a story like this a few months ago, I'd have laughed it off. But now I'm not so sure of anything anymore. All I know is that there's something wrong in this town. Something dark and secret, something that doesn't want to be uncovered. As the days grew shorter and the nights longer, I found myself sinking deeper into a state of constant unease. The encounter with the one-legged figure had shaken me to my core, but life in the small town continued on as if nothing had happened. I tried to convince myself that it had been a hallucination, a trick of the light and fog, but deep down, I knew better. Work at the factory became my anchor, a mundane routine to cling to in a world that suddenly seemed far from normal. I threw myself into my tasks, staying late most nights, partly to prove my worth in my new position, but mostly to avoid going home to an empty house filled with shadows and whispers. One evening, as I was leaving work, I noticed something odd about the old clock tower in the town square. It had always been a bit unreliable, but now it seemed to be running backwards. I blinked, sure I was seeing things, but no, the hands were definitely moving counterclockwise. I glanced around, wondering if anyone else had noticed, but the few people still out on the street seemed oblivious. I approached an elderly woman who was locking up the small bookstore across the street. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice casual, "is it just me, or is that clock running backwards?" She looked at me, then at the clock, her face unreadable. "Oh, that old thing," she said with a dismissive wave. "It's been acting up for years. Best not to pay it any mind." But as she turned away, I could have sworn I saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. That night, I dreamed of clocks. Hundreds of them, all ticking out of sync, their hands spinning wildly in both directions. And in the distance, always just out of reach, the sound of uneven footsteps and a voice calling out, "Time, give me back my time." I woke up in a cold sweat, the dream clinging to me like cobwebs. As I stumbled to the bathroom to splash water on my face, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. For a moment, just a split second, I thought I saw someone else standing behind me, a pale figure with sorrowful eyes. But when I spun around, the bathroom was empty. The next day at work, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I turned my back, I felt eyes on me. More than once, I spun around, half expecting to see the one-legged figure, but there was never anything there. Just concerned looks from my coworkers, who were starting to notice my increasingly erratic behavior. During lunch break, I overheard two of my colleagues whispering. "He's been acting strange lately," one of them said. "Do you think he's, you know?" "Shoo," the other replied. "Don't even think about it. You know what happened to the last outsider who started asking questions?" They fell silent as soon as they noticed me, but their words echoed in my mind. What had happened to the last outsider? And what questions had they been asking? As the days passed, more strange occurrences piled up. The leaves on the trees seemed to change color overnight, cycling through autumn hues at an impossible speed. Sometimes, when I walked past the old railway station on my way to work, I could have sworn I heard the distant sound of a train whistle, even though no trains had run through this town in decades. One particularly cold morning, I arrived at the factory to find everyone gathered in the break room, whispering urgently. As soon as I entered, they fell silent, but I managed to catch a few words, just like before, and "it's starting again." I tried to ask what was going on, but everyone suddenly became very interested in their coffee cups or the floor tiles. Finally, my supervisor pulled me aside. "Listen," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I know you're new here, so let me give you some advice. There are things in this town, things we don't talk about. For your own good, keep your head down and your mouth shut. Understand?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As I turned to go to my workstation, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, on the bulletin board among the safety notices and shift schedules, was a crude drawing. A stick figure with one leg, just like the one I'd seen carved into the old railway station. That night, as I walked home, the fog rolled in thick and heavy. The streetlights seemed dimmer than usual, barely penetrating the mist. And in that fog, I began to see shapes. Vague, indistinct forms that seemed to flit just at the edge of my vision. And always, the feeling of being followed. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. The shapes in the fog seemed to be closing in, and I could hear something. A scraping sound, like something being dragged across the pavement. And then, a voice. "Please, help me find my leg." I broke into a run, not daring to look back. I didn't stop until I was safely inside my house, the door locked behind me. As I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath, I heard something that made my heart skip a beat. A soft thump, drag sound, coming from upstairs. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone, intending to call. Who? The police? What would I tell them? That I was being haunted by a one-legged ghost? That the whole town seemed to be caught in some kind of supernatural conspiracy of silence? As I stood there, paralyzed with indecision, the thumping sound grew louder. It was coming down the stairs now. Thump, drag. Thump, drag. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that when I opened them, this would all turn out to be another nightmare. But the sound kept coming closer. Thump, drag. And then, silence. I opened my eyes slowly, dreading what I might see. But the hallway was empty. No figure, no ghost. Just the normal shadows of my house at night. I let out a shaky breath, feeling a mix of relief and lingering terror. Had I imagined it all? Was I losing my mind? As I moved to turn on the lights, my foot hit something on the floor. I looked down and felt my heart stop. There, on the hardwood floor, was a single muddy footprint. But it wasn't a normal footprint. It was elongated, distorted, as if made by someone dragging their foot. Or by someone with only one leg. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. This was real. This was happening. And somehow, I knew that this was only the beginning. The next few days passed in a blur of paranoia and sleepless nights. I started noticing things I hadn't before. The way some houses in town had strange symbols carved into their door frames. How certain streets seemed to change configuration when you weren't looking directly at them. The fact that no one ever seemed to leave town, and visitors were rare. At work, the tension was palpable. People spoke in hushed tones, always falling silent when I approached. More than once, I caught my coworkers giving me strange looks, a mix of pity and fear in their eyes. One day, as I was walking home, I decided to take a detour through the old part of town. The streets here were narrower, the buildings older and more decrepit. As I passed by an antique shop, something in the window caught my eye. It was an old photograph, sepia-toned and faded. It showed a group of people standing in front of the railway station, all dressed in clothes from the early 1900s. But what made me stop in my tracks was one of the figures in the photo. Standing at the edge of the group was a man who looked eerily familiar. He had the same gaunt face, the same sorrowful eyes as the figure I'd seen in the fog. And his right leg was missing. I pressed my face against the glass, trying to get a better look. But as I did, I saw a reflection in the window. Standing behind me was the figure from the photograph, its one leg casting an impossible shadow in the fading daylight. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but the street was empty. When I looked back at the window, the photograph was gone, replaced by a collection of old dolls with blank, staring eyes. As I hurried home, my mind was racing. What was happening to me? What was happening to this town? The weight of it all was becoming unbearable. I reached my front door, fumbling with the keys, desperate to get inside where I thought I'd be safe. But as I pushed the door open, I heard it again. That soft, almost whisper-like voice. "Find my leg." I froze, 1 foot over the threshold. Part of me wanted to slam the door shut and run, to pack my bags and leave this cursed town behind. But where would I go? Who would believe me? And would these horrors follow me even if I left? With a shaky breath, I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. I leaned against it, sliding down to sit on the floor, my head in my hands. I was trapped. Not by locks or bars, but by fear and confusion and the terrible knowledge that something was very, very wrong in this town. As I sat there, trying to calm my racing heart, I couldn't help but wonder, why me? Why did I have to move to this godforsaken place? If only I'd turned down that promotion, if only I'd stayed in the city. But regrets wouldn't change my situation. I was here now, caught up in something I didn't understand and didn't want to be part of. Yet somehow, I knew that ignoring it wouldn't make it go away. Whatever was happening, whatever dark secret this town was hiding, it had noticed me. And I had a sinking feeling that it wouldn't let me go easily. I didn't want to be a hero. I didn't want to solve any mysteries or uncover any secrets. All I wanted was for things to go back to normal. But as I sat there on the floor of my dark hallway, listening to the unnatural silence of the house, I realized that normal might not be an option anymore. Thump, thump, drag. The sound came from upstairs, soft but unmistakable. I held my breath, hoping it was just my imagination. But then it came again. Thump, thump, drag. Whatever was up there, whatever horror awaited me, I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. Sooner or later, I would have to face it. Not because I was brave or curious, but because I had no other choice. With trembling legs, I stood up. Each step towards the stairs felt like it took all my strength. But I kept going, driven not by courage, but by the terrifying certainty that running away wasn't an option. As I placed my foot on the first step, I heard it again. Clearer this time, filled with a desperation that chilled me to the bone. Find my leg. And I knew, with a certainty that terrified me, that my nightmare was only beginning. Thump, thump, drag. The sound echoed through the house, each repetition sending a chill down my spine. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, my hand gripping the banister so tightly my knuckles had turned white. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of the house and never look back. But where would I go? Who would believe me? With each shaky step up the stairs, the sound grew louder. Thump, thump, drag. It was coming from my bedroom. The door was closed, a thin strip of darkness visible underneath. As I reached the landing, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A trail of wet, muddy footprints led from the top of the stairs to my bedroom door. But they weren't normal footprints. They were elongated, distorted, as if made by someone dragging their foot. Or by someone with only one leg. I stood there, frozen, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Part of me didn't want to open it, didn't want to see what was waiting for me on the other side. But I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. With a deep breath, I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside my window. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Then my eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I saw it. A figure, standing in the corner of the room. It was the same gaunt, sorrowful-looking man I'd seen in the fog in my dreams. His right leg was missing, the empty space where it should have been somehow more terrifying than any gruesome wound could have been. "Find my leg," it whispered, its voice a mix of desperation and accusation. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could I say? What could I do? The figure took a step towards me, its movement accompanied by that terrible thump, thump, drag sound. Panic overtook me. I slammed the door shut and ran down the stairs, nearly tripping in my haste. I didn't stop until I was out of the house, standing in the middle of the street, gasping for air. The night was quiet, almost unnaturally so. No crickets chirping, no distant sound of traffic. Just silence, broken only by my ragged breathing. I looked up and down the street, half expecting to see my neighbors peering out their windows at the commotion. But all the houses were dark, their windows like empty eyes staring out into the night. I couldn't go back inside. Not with whatever that was in there. But I couldn't just stand in the street all night either. I needed help, but who could I turn to? The police? They'd think I was crazy. My coworkers? They'd been acting strange ever since I arrived in town. Then I remembered the old man at the diner, the one who had warned me about the town's secrets. Maybe he knew something, maybe he could help. It was a long shot, but it was all I had. I started walking, my feet carrying me towards the center of town. The streets were deserted, the shops all closed and dark. As I passed by the old clock tower in the town square, I noticed something odd. The clock face was blank, its hands missing. Had it always been like that? I could have sworn it had been working just yesterday. The diner was at the end of the main street, its neon sign casting a sickly glow on the sidewalk. To my surprise, the lights were on inside. I approached cautiously, peering through the window. The old man was there, sitting alone at the counter, a cup of coffee in front of him. It was as if he had been waiting for me. I pushed open the door, the little bell above it jingling cheerfully, the sound jarringly out of place in the eerie silence of the night. The old man didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge my presence at all. I slid onto the stool next to him, my heart pounding in my chest. I need help, I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. The old man slowly turned to look at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and resignation. "You've seen him, haven't you?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. "The one-legged man." I nodded, unable to speak. The old man sighed, taking a sip of his coffee before continuing. "It all started a long time ago," he began, his voice low and gravelly. "This town, it wasn't always like this. Once, it was a bustling place, full of life and promise. The railroad was our lifeblood, bringing people and goods from all over." He paused, his eyes taking on a faraway look. But then came the accident. A stormy night, much like tonight. A man fell onto the tracks, right as the train was coming through. They say he lost his leg instantly, but lived long enough to drag himself to the station house, leaving a trail of blood behind him. I shuddered, remembering the muddy footprints in my house. The old man continued, seemingly lost in the memory. "He died there, alone in the dark. But that wasn't the end of it. People started seeing things. A figure limping along the tracks at night. Strange sounds coming from the old station house. And always, that feeling of being watched. He turned to look at me, his eyes suddenly sharp and focused. The town tried to move on, to forget. But some things don't want to be forgotten. Some things can't rest until they're made right. What do you mean, made right? I asked, dreading the answer. The old man opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the lights in the diner flickered and went out. We were plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the sickly glow of the neon sign outside. And then we heard it. Thump, thump, drag. Coming from outside the diner, getting closer. "He's found you," the old man whispered, his voice filled with fear. "And he won't stop until you find his leg." The sound was at the door now. Thump, thump, drag. I turned, my heart in my throat, as the bell above the door jingled. The door swung open slowly, revealing a dark, limping figure silhouetted against the neon light. "Find my leg," it whispered, the words seeming to echo in the empty diner. I looked back at the old man, desperate for help, for answers. But the stool next to me was empty. I was alone. As the figure limped into the diner, I realized with a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning. Whatever dark secret this town was hiding, whatever tragedy had occurred all those years ago, I was now a part of it. And somehow, I knew that until I uncovered the truth, until I found that missing leg, I would never be free. The figure was getting closer, its hand reaching out towards me. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for whatever was about to happen. But instead of a cold, ghostly touch, I felt something being pressed into my hand. I opened my eyes and looked down. It was an old, rusted key. When I looked up again, the figure was gone. The lights in the diner flickered back to life, revealing an empty, ordinary restaurant. No sign of the old man, no sign of the ghostly figure. Just me, alone, holding a mysterious key. As I stared at the key in my hand, I realized that I had a choice to make. I could try to ignore all of this, could try to convince myself it was all a hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep. I could pack my bags and leave town, try to outrun the horror that had invaded my life. Or I could use this key. Could follow wherever it led, uncover the truth behind the one-legged man and the town's dark secret. It wasn't a choice I wanted to make, wasn't a responsibility I had ever asked for. But as I sat there in the empty diner, the key cold and heavy in my hand, I knew what I had to do. Because sometimes, the only way out is through. And sometimes, the ghosts of the past don't rest until someone is brave enough, or foolish enough, to listen to their story. With a deep breath, I stood up. Whatever this key opened, whatever truth it led to, I knew I had to see it through to the end. Not out of courage or curiosity, but out of the simple, terrifying knowledge that I had no other choice. As I stepped out of the diner into the dark, silent night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into something far bigger and more dangerous than I could imagine. But I also knew that turning back was no longer an option. The truth was out there, hidden in the shadows and whispered on the wind. And for better or worse, I was going to find it. The key felt like ice in my palm as I stood before the old railway station. Moonlight cast long shadows across the overgrown tracks, and a chill wind whispered through the rusted metal, carrying with it the faint echo of long-forgotten train whistles. My hand trembled as I inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a grinding sound that seemed to echo in the stillness of the night. The door creaked open, revealing a darkness so thick it seemed to push back against the beam of my flashlight. The smell hit me first, musty, damp, with an underlying scent that made my stomach churn. I stepped inside, my footsteps stirring up clouds of dust. Cobwebs clung to my face as I moved deeper into the station, and I had to fight the urge to turn and run. Thump, thump, drag. The sound came from somewhere ahead, muffled but unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat as I swept the flashlight beam across the room. It illuminated an old ticket counter, its wood warped and peeling, and a schedule board with faded, illegible writing. As I moved further in, my light fell on something that made my blood run cold. A trapdoor, half hidden under a moldy rug. The iron ring set into the wood seemed to gleam with an unnatural light. Thump, thump, drag. The sound was coming from below. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to forget about this cursed town and its secrets. But as I stood there, heart pounding, I realized I was already in too deep. Whatever was down there, I had to face it. With shaking hands, I grasped the iron ring and pulled. The trapdoor opened with a groan that seemed to come from the bowels of the earth itself. A rush of cold, damp air hit my face, carrying with it the scent of decay and something else, something metallic and sickly sweet. My flashlight beam disappeared into the darkness below, swallowed up by the gloom. The stairs creaked ominously as I descended, each step feeling like it might be my last before the wood gave way beneath me. At the bottom, a narrow corridor stretched into the darkness. The walls were slick with moisture, and I could hear the distant drip of water echoing from somewhere ahead. Thump, thump, drag. Closer now. Almost eager. I inched forward, my free hand trailing along the damp wall for support. The beam of my flashlight danced crazily ahead of me, revealing glimpses of rusted pipes and crumbling brickwork. The corridor ended at a heavy wooden door. Carved into its surface was that same crude, one-legged figure I'd seen before. My hand shook as I reached for the handle, the metal ice-cold against my skin. The door swung open with a low groan, revealing a circular room. The walls were lined with shelves, each one sagging under the weight of dusty boxes and strange, misshapen objects. In the center of the room stood a table, and on it, my stomach lurched. A leg. Withered and mummified, but unmistakably human. Find leg. The whisper came from behind me, a sound so faint I almost thought I'd imagined it. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. There, at the edge of the light, stood the figure. More substantial now, but still with that terrible emptiness where its right leg should have been. Its eyes, sunken and filled with an unimaginable sorrow, locked onto mine. I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. The flashlight slipped from my numb fingers, clattering to the floor. In the new angle of light, I saw something that made my heart stop. The figure cast no shadow. Find leg. It repeated, gesturing towards the mummified limb on the table. With trembling hands, I picked up the leg. It was lighter than I expected, like holding a piece of old driftwood. As soon as I lifted it, a change came over the room. The air grew thick and heavy, pressing in on me from all sides. The figure reached out, its hand passing through the leg as if it were smoke. For a moment, just a moment, I saw a flicker of something in its eyes. Relief? Gratitude? But then it was gone, and with it, the figure itself, fading away like mist in the morning sun. I stood there, alone in the underground room, holding a mummified leg and surrounded by boxes of who knew what. The silence was deafening. Numbly, I began to look through the boxes. They were filled with papers, photographs, old ledgers. As I flipped through them, a story began to emerge. A story of corruption, of powerful men doing terrible things to keep their power. And of one man who tried to stop them, who paid the ultimate price for his courage. I don't know how long I was down there, poring over those old documents. But when I finally climbed back up to the station, pale morning light was streaming through the dirty windows. The town was stirring to life as I emerged from the station. Early risers gave me strange looks as I passed, my clothes dusty and disheveled, my arms full of old papers. I ignored them, my mind reeling from what I'd discovered. Over the next few days, the town changed. As the truth spread, people reacted in different ways. Some were angry, demanding justice for long-buried crimes. Others were in denial, refusing to believe that their quiet little town could hide such secrets. And some just disappeared. I'd see moving trucks in the dead of night, houses suddenly empty with no explanation. The local paper ran story after story, each one revealing more of the town's dark past. The mayor resigned. The police chief was arrested. It seemed like every day brought a new revelation, a new shock. Through it all, I kept to myself. I'd done what I needed to do. I'd found the leg, uncovered the truth. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. That there was more to the story, more secrets waiting to be uncovered. And sometimes, late at night, I'd hear it. Faint, almost like an echo on the wind. Thump, thump, drag. A reminder, perhaps, that some stories don't have neat endings. That some ghosts are never truly laid to rest. As for me, I'm still here, in this strange little town with its newly uncovered past. I don't know if I'll ever leave. Maybe I can't. Maybe I'm a part of this place now, for better or worse. All I know is that the next time I hear that sound in the night, I'll be ready. Ready to uncover whatever secrets still lie hidden in the shadows of this town. Because sometimes, the only way to escape the past is to face it head on. No matter how terrifying it might be. It's been a few months since the incident at the old railway station. Things have quieted down in town, but there's a tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. I've been thinking about moving on, but something keeps me here. Maybe it's the feeling that there's more to uncover, or maybe I'm just not ready to face the outside world again. Before I wrap up this story, there's one more thing that happened recently. It's short, but it's been keeping me up at night. Last week, I was walking home late from the diner. The streets were empty, and a thick fog had rolled in from the hills. As I passed by the old cemetery, I heard something that made me stop in my tracks. A child's laughter. It was faint, almost lost in the mist, but unmistakable. I turned towards the sound, peering through the wrought iron gates of the cemetery. That's when I saw her. A little girl, maybe 6 or 7, standing among the gravestones. She was wearing an old-fashioned dress, the kind you'd see in photographs from a century ago. Her back was to me, and she seemed to be looking at something on the ground. I called out, asking if she was okay, if she was lost. She didn't respond. I took a step closer, and that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. I could see through her. The girl turned then, and for a moment our eyes met. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and sad. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, she pointed at something behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there. When I looked back, the girl was gone. I've been back to that cemetery every night since then, but I haven't seen her again. I've asked around town, tried to find out if there's any history of a young girl dying here, but everyone clams up when I start asking questions. It seems this town has more secrets than I thought, and I'm starting to wonder if I'll ever uncover them all. But that's a story for another time. For now, I'll keep watching, keep listening. Because in this town, you never know what might be hiding in the fog.